It's my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Paul Steinberg. Dr. Steinberg is a professor of political science and environmental policy at Harvey Mudd College, where he holds the Malcolm Lewis Chair in Sustainability in Society. He's the author of 3 books, his latest entitled Who Rules the Earth? Dr. Steinberg is a 2016 recipient of the International Studies Association for Innovative Teaching Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Steinberg.
Thank you very much. And I was actually at the hotel where they put us all up at the Excelsior in town. Realized that I was sitting next to a couple of the other speakers last night, and we were exchanging notes, and we all agreed that this is the best organized conference we have ever been to, so by far. And so clearly the rule and lesson that comes out of that is don't leave it to academics. Let the students organize these kinds of things, because it's really been outstanding. So thank you. Let me start with a quote from Benjamin Franklin, which I'll let you folks read. Thank you. And can you hear me in the back, by the way? I opted to go without the projection. Are we okay in the back? Okay, awesome. So Benjamin Franklin worked in the printing trade and was writing about the fact that lead was known to have very strong toxicity and was extremely dangerous in its effects. And as a matter of fact, it was with full knowledge of these effects when the United States decided to add lead to gasoline to improve octane. In fact, the League of Nations, that often derided, defunct precursor to the United Nations, the League of Nations had an international treaty to remove all lead from interior paints. And Europe signed it and the United States didn't. So in Eugene, when you're engaging in home improvement in a house older than about the early 1970s, you have to be extremely cautious, and parents are just terrified about windowsills and their babies and so forth. Not the case in Europe, okay? Because of a decision to ignore that treaty. And so when the United States added lead to gasoline, it was over the protests of Harvard's first female professor, Alice Hamilton, who was also the country's foremost expert on the toxic effects of lead, when she said, if this is a probable danger, shall we not say it's going to be an extremely widespread one, an extraordinarily widespread one? And in fact, she brought this concern. She had been working in what were called the dangerous trades, with workers who were handling lead on a daily basis in factories, and she knew that it would literally drive people to insanity. And she said, you can control this in the factory. How are we possibly, if we're going to add it to gasoline, going to control it nationwide? The U.S. Surgeon General had a workshop to discuss this. She made her case. It was ignored. And this is what happened. So these data are from a variety of sources. Don't worry about the units on the y-axis for now, but it's, micrograms per kiloliter blood and so forth. But basically what you see is an increase from the time that lead was introduced in gasoline in lead content in Arctic ice and snow, in the beaches of California, in sediments of Sweden, and then a subsequent decline when it was banned only in the 1990s in blood levels in kids and elsewhere. And that decline is not the lead going away. That's subsequent generations of kids or different horizons in the soil profile. The lead stays, okay? And so the point here is that the linkage between ideas and action is not automatic. Why is my phone beeping when it's on silent? Fascinating. Let us turn it off. There, we have turned off the phone. Somewhere in Southern California, a kid is at a sleepover complaining about something. This is my parenting skills at work. I'll do what he does to me, turn off the phone. So the point being that there's no direct route between new ideas and actions. And this is all the more noteworthy because it really varies across issues. Sometimes it's quite rapid. So with respect to ozone depletion, it was only in 1973, 74 when the first papers were published by Rowland and Molina on the fact that these refrigerants, these chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs, were depleting ozone. It was only in the mid-70s, essentially, when we even knew that that was the case. And by 1989, 15 years later, we had an international treaty to ban this stuff. And the US acted even faster, unilaterally, way before Europe, which refused to do it. Okay, and so 15 years to get an international treaty, that's nothing. That's a blink of an eye, right? So sometimes it's quite fast. Another case would be local air pollution. This was a trickier case because when smog first started appearing in Los Angeles in the 1940s and 50s, we didn't even know what causes it. And so the first social movement in the United States to get rid of smog came out of LA when citizens and policymakers started mobilizing about this, but at the time they didn't even know that cars are a cause of smog, so it was especially difficult. And you'll love this. It was a college football game at which Planet Earth figured out that cars cause smog. It was Cal versus Stanford. I grew up in Berkeley. It was Cal. This is the moment where I do not say go Bears. This is Cal versus Stanford, and there was a huge traffic jam, and they noticed that the smog got horrible in the East Bay immediately after. That was the first time that any scientist or regulator on planet Earth realized that cars cause smog. Okay, so it was difficult. They didn't even know, but once it was figured out, they started banning this stuff, and there's been reductions in air pollution measured here through particulates in Los Angeles ever since. And this movement started in LA, spread to California, then the United States, and around the world. Actually, St. Louis, Missouri was also on the cutting edge of this stuff. So the point here is that it raises this broader question of how can we actually turn ideas into actions? What is that relationship between ideas and actions? And here I don't just care about research that earned Roland and Molina a Nobel Prize on the ozone layer. I'm talking about your ideas, my ideas, right? Our ideas. So here we are in a university setting. We're studying all this stuff. We're trying to develop our minds and come up with innovative notions. How can we actually build a bridge between our ideas and social change? And so what I thought I would do, and here when I say ideas, this could be academic research, this could be a new design, this could be food systems research, what have you. So what I thought I'd do is share a few reflections in a kind of autobiographical way on my own attempts over the past 31 years to try and mobilize ideas and have some semblance of social impact. And I say 31 years because it was in 1987 when I was a junior in college, and I created this group called Scientists and Engineers for Responsible Technology. So I was in biology before I sort of transitioned into public policy and now political science, which is what I do for a living. And at the time, it was very difficult for science students to be able to find a job outside of the defense sector. And so we created this group that was about stopping the arms race and mobilizing technology for better ends. And one of the first things I learned from that experience is the importance of focusing on lasting change, long-term change. And this was done in two ways. So this group lasted for about 12 years after I graduated. And one thing that we had implemented from the get-go was the revolving clipboard. That is to say, don't let there just be one charismatic student leader who's always the one at the rallies, always the one meeting with the university administration, et cetera. Rotate the clipboard at each meeting so that somebody else is in charge of the meeting. In fact, when I was funding a student group not long ago on my own campus, I said, I will provide this money to you if if half the attendees at your conference are either frosh or sophomores. In other words, keep the leadership fresh by bringing in underclassmen. But more importantly, in this case, of all the things that we did, and it was a very active group, we had about 20 people showing up on a weekly basis from different science majors and pushing for all kinds of local changes. Interestingly, one of the things that I would have thought was not as significant taught me a lesson. A small grouping wanted to create a fund for socially responsible senior engineering projects. And they went around campus and they managed to raise $10,000 that cranks out about a $500 reward every year. And interestingly, that's the thing that lasted. So, fast forward 10 years, and, the group sort of started to fall apart. I would follow it in the news once in a while, and I could see there was one guy who was always appearing, so the clipboard wasn't rotating anymore, and you could tell the group was probably therefore gonna fold when he graduated. But the thing that lasted was this new kind of institution that was created. All right, so think about lasting change is sort of a first lesson I would pull out of this. Now, this was a rather modest effort at UC Santa Barbara back in the day. But it was the beginning of my lifelong interest in figuring out how to mobilize ideas in working with groups like these. So these are the groups that I've worked, well, a sort of subset of groups I've worked with either as a consultant or full-time, from nonprofit organizations to governmental organizations, occasionally the private sector, and so forth. And so I thought I would just share with you, not because I'm some exemplar for social influence, but just sort of, perspective from the trenches to share with you guys, and I'm very interested to hear your experiences with this as well. So let's talk about one model for doing so, namely influence the influencer. So under this model, basically you're whispering in the ear of an influential person and then let them worry about social change, right? Let them worry about how exactly you take that idea and turn it into change on the ground. So this could be the director of a nonprofit or a journalist, and then they're the ones who are responsible with their staff and everything for bringing about change. So let me start with the wrong way to do it, because this is not going to be a series of, wonderful successes over a 31-year period, and here I am to share with you the fruits of my, unmitigated success. No, there's abysmal failures in the mix, all right? So first let's start with how you do not impact social change with your ideas. And that is to publish a paper. Now, I love publishing papers. I judge colleagues' ability to stay at my university on the basis of their ability to publish papers. Very important mechanism of knowledge production. But it's not going to change the world. So early on, I had this paper that looked at where do the World Bank and U.S. Agency for International Development spend money on biodiversity conservation, which matters because the World Bank, we tend to think of it as big bad guy creating dams in developing countries, is actually the world's largest funder of biodiversity conservation, period, to the tune of over $100 billion at this point. Okay, and U.S. Agency for International Development is the branch of the U.S. government that provides foreign aid. And so I looked at where they spend money, and I said, what determines what countries they spend money in? And I figured it out statistically. I was very proud of myself, fresh from my doctoral statistical training. I figured out that a lot of their projects go to places that have nothing to do with biodiversity and nothing to do with development. So this paper gets published, and I thought, oh boy. I was waiting for that phone to ring with irate World Bank officials, just trying to tear into my results, and the data would just carry itself and just crush them mercilessly as they tried. And instead what I heard was this. Okay, so from this experience, I learned that publishing a paper does not in and of itself result in anything. And we've all encountered news stories, some graduate student published a paper and oh my gosh, the Forest Service is up in arms. It's selection bias. It doesn't typically work that way, okay? So that was a kind of learning experience of sorts. Well, fast forward a couple of years, and soon after finishing my PhD, I was at Duke University for a couple of years, hadn't found the right tenure track job, and accepted a position working for the research branch of the World Bank on this report right here. Now, for those of you who are in international development, know this is probably the world's most influential publication on the topic of international development, the World Development Report that comes out every year. Okay, so this is very high-profile stuff. And they had done a report 10 years prior that was very influential in my own thinking about sustainable development and what that means. So the World Bank also has more PhDs thinking about development than any other organization by far in the world, okay? So I was very excited to join this group, and what they do is they draw researchers from throughout the bank and they put them together in an office for about a year, and they grabbed me too, and I was the one political scientist in a group of 8 economists. And so I thought, now my ideas are going to have an influence, now that I'm involved with this report. And in fact, it went one further. They had a box, these boxes in these reports, right? A box about my first book, right? So summarizing insights from, I wrote a book called, this is based on my dissertation research, called Environmental Leadership in Developing Countries. So what I do for a living is I have politically sensitive conversations with incredibly powerful people in foreign countries, in foreign languages, trying to understand why things sometimes go right. So it's sort of the politics of achieving conservation and other sustainable goals, and they featured it in this box, right? Moreover, not only that, but at one point, the International Monetary Fund was supposed to bring to the Johannesburg Summit, a follow-up to the Earth Summit, a list a concise list of recommendations for change on planet Earth. And my recommendation was one of the 10 that made it on that fax that was sent over of if you want to create change, you need to support leaders on the ground in developing countries. And so I thought, now my ideas are going to have an influence. I'll spare you the cricket sound effects this time. It did not. It did not. There was no influence. No influence. No influence I'm aware of. Okay. So what's going on here? What's going on here is that if you want your ideas to have an impact on the world, you need an organization that is totally devoted to that goal. Okay? Not just the World Bank cranking out this publication and featuring, no, no, no. Like staff working on implementing your idea. It takes an organization. Okay? And that's something that I think a lot of, dare I say, a lot of young people, without slandering you guys, I find the career orientation that says I'm not going to work for an organization, I'm going to do this on my own in an independent fashion. I see people doing that and 7, 8 years later beat up coming back to work for an organization because they didn't want to spend all their time writing grants and doing the accounting and submitting taxes. It actually takes an organization to get stuff done, working together, social cooperation. Okay? So it takes an organization. Now this is especially significant because professors do not have organizations at their disposal. In particular, professors don't have staff. We have, in our organizational mode, it's a lone wolf model. So professors, academics, have an almost unheard of degree of autonomy, right? We almost don't have bosses at all, right? There's some people, you know, but relative to almost any industry, it's a degree of freedom and autonomy that is just unheard of, right? And that model, that organizational model, is very good for generating innovative ideas, right? Go off, do your thing. You were brought here on a competitive basis and generate cool new ideas. And that's why universities are one of the major wellsprings for this. But I would argue that that same organizational model that's so good at generating ideas is exceptionally poor at disseminating those ideas. So, you know, it's sort of my age in my 50s, you know, I have my peers and you know, other grads and friends in different sectors. My friends in the private sector, if they have a new idea, they open a new office somewhere, right? They hire new staff, they make something happen. The same is true for a nonprofit director. Oh, we're going to go in this direction, let's do this. Professors can't actually do that, right? We have in some cases the research institute with that one staff person who's very helpful, right? But we don't actually have a mechanism for mobilizing ideas. And you would think, looking at a university, that professors have organizations. That all has all the trappings, right? But none of those staff are actually working to advance the impact of those professors' ideas in society beyond, obviously, in the classroom. Okay? So is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It's just a thing. And so because of this, it's especially important to understand that it does take an organization, in fact, to implement ideas. Well, just as my year at the World Bank was winding down, I received a phone call. And this phone call was from someone named Lorian Belton, who said, yes, my boss at Rare Conservation read your book and would like to have lunch. And I was in Washington, D.C., and my World Bank gig was winding down. My wife was pregnant. I had no health insurance. And I said, sure, I'll have lunch. So we had lunch. And I realized by the end of this lunch that he was offering me a year's salary to help him create a program to implement the ideas in my book. Or so I thought. He said, we want a new program in policy and governance. Oops, backwards. There we go. At this organization right here, Rare Conservation. I subsequently came to learn this is probably the world's most effective grassroots environmental education organization. Okay? And they work throughout the tropics and are very good at getting small communities really excited about conservation. So when you hear of conservation successes throughout the tropics, oftentimes their signature approach of pride campaigns, these 18-month campaigns, are behind it. Okay? So now I thought, okay, I've got an organization that is interested in what I'm doing, so perhaps this is going to be really the time where my ideas are going to have an impact. And I would say they did, sort of. Sort of. So here's what I learned from that experience. You know, in an ideal world, you'd come up with an idea, right? You wouldn't have to find an organization to implement it. They would knock at your door, and they would say, hi, we're interested in your idea. our staff don't already have full-time commitments. We have a budget, and we would like you to just stay involved at a level that you're interested in and ways that advance your career personally. Would you be interested? So that would be a really great knock on the door, right? In reality, organizations have pre-existing commitments of all sorts. It's what political scientists call the garbage can model of organizational change, which is to say organizations have all these different ideas that have come through the decades, and they have staff expertise on the basis of those past campaigns, those past priorities, those past budgets, right? And so that's what you get. So when working with RARE, I learned a couple of things. One is, and it's a great organization, but one is learn the culture. So on day one at RARE in their sort of employee orientation, I sat in this little room, and they played this video for me, an introduction to their organization. And there were all these people in animal costumes dancing about with kids in villages and coastal communities, and I thought, what have I signed up for here, right? Coming from the World Bank, I was really unsure. Now, it turns out there's a methodology behind all of this that, in fact, Fast Company has written up several times. RARE has received the Social Entrepreneur of the Year award and so forth as a mechanism for awareness raising. But my point is that one has to understand organizational culture. So if social change requires that your ideas find a home in an organization, you want to be a quick study, and to be a quick study requires understanding the culture of this place. How do you understand the culture of a place? What do they value? When they talk about people who are really outstanding in their staff, why is it? Why are they still referring to that one person? What are the adjectives that they're using to describe that person? All of these are signaling what's of value in this place. There's also work routines. So I realized a little late, actually, that you're supposed to stay at a nonprofit, at an organization like this. You're supposed to stay late. Just stay late, work late. In an academic, it's like, see you in 6 years. If you didn't publish, you're fired. You know, like you have all the leeway you possibly need. But actually, in that environment, if I went home at 5:30 or whatever, that was considered not signaling a commitment to the cause. I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like at first I just found it obnoxious, and later I realized, oh, no, this is how they roll, and I need to sort of play that game if I'm going to be effective here. Social background is important in getting a read on the culture of the place. So I would say at RARE, I had much less in common. I would expect, philosophically, that it would be much easier for the staff at this organization to understand me and vice versa than at the World Bank, because my philosophy is about biodiversity conservation, right? But actually, it was much easier for me to work with the World Bank. Why? I was surrounded with a bunch of PhD economists. They all got their PhDs, I got my PhD. They completely understood what I do for a living just by virtue of my profession. Whereas at RARE, it was very different. There was more of a social distance. People had different kinds of backgrounds. These are grassroots organizers of various education levels. They're not doing research for a living. And there were trust issues. There were significant trust issues as they were trying to make sense of me and I was trying to make sense of them. Another point regarding working with an organization is that your idea must advance their mission, okay? Nonprofits have missions. They're very mission-oriented. And in fact, business strategists have noticed that nonprofits have missions and have said the business world isn't good enough at having missions. So when you hear these days about businesses having a mission, that came from the nonprofit world. So nonprofits have strong missions. And if you come to them and you say, hey, I have this really cool idea, and yeah, it fits with that part of your mission, but could we also do this part of my idea that's really off base? Not a chance. They're not going to meet you where you are. They're not going to be able to justify to their board of directors and constituencies and donors moving at all off of mission, okay? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is that they have a competitive niche that they have to play vis-a-vis other nonprofit organizations. So by way of illustration, I was asked, all right, if this organization is going to get involved in policy, which was my job, so they've got these grassroots organizers, these education campaigns, and they want to get involved in policy change. How's that going to happen? I said, here's how it happens. I've studied this stuff. I talk with people all over the world. Let me tell you what's up. Here's what you do. You take newly elected officials in a developing country right after an election, and you have a retreat that's oriented toward conservation. Give them lots of unstructured time where they could take little walks in the woods and talk to themselves. And out of that, very frequently results significant policy changes. That's where Costa Rica's constitutional amendment for the environment came from. That's where Bolivia's forestry law came from. It was a methodology that was pioneered by Thomas Lovejoy of the Smithsonian Institution. I said, this is what you want to do. And it turns out they couldn't do that. And I said, why? And they said, well, the Organization for Tropical Studies does that. I said, yeah, they do that in 2 countries, and they have told me they don't plan to do it anywhere else. They said, can't sell it, because someone else is doing it. Because RARE has to have a unique niche and sort of signature methodologies, and if they're just copying and expanding what this one organization that's never going to expand does, not good enough. So that idea couldn't have been the idea. So that's just another thing I learned along the way in trying to bring ideas into organizations. Another thing is you have to understand their capacities and their limitations. So we were talking about one program possibility would be to have local environmental management, particularly mayors. So local governments have been given more and more power around the world over the last 20 years. There's a massive worldwide phenomenon called decentralization, where suddenly in over 60 developing countries, local governments have more power than ever before over local resources. So the fate of the Amazon is going to be decided by Brazilian mayors to a large degree, okay? And so the idea was, oh, well, RARE works locally. Local policy, this is something we can do. And I said, all right. I said, you should work in Mexico. I said, why? And I said, because Mexico has gone farther than any other country on earth in empowering communities to manage their forests. And it turns out that they should not work in Mexico. Why? RARE has strong presence in Honduras, a strong presence in Guatemala, a strong presence in Indonesia, and 3 or 4 other places. They don't have as much legitimacy in Mexico. So even though I, with my idea, might in the abstract say, oh, Mexico's the place for community forestry, it's like, really? Where they don't have a strong presence, or a place where it could still work, not as well as Mexico, but RARE is recognized by everybody in the country, right? And so again, they don't just invent themselves from scratch. They have a history, and that history matters, okay? In terms of capacities and limitations. It was also, and more significantly, clear that RARE's staff were not policy people. These are folks who can go into a village in the middle of nowhere and everybody knows their name. They work with the teachers, they work with priests and DJs when they're doing these education campaigns. But to approach a congressperson, to actually call, a member of the presidential staff, these folks, socially, by way of their background, professionally, no way. They didn't have the contacts, they didn't have the confidence, they didn't have the they couldn't do it. And so, again, it's not like RARE's going to suddenly have a staff that can get involved in policy. They're doing grassroots education, okay? So, in the end, one more note here concerning resources. So, the final thing that I learned in this collaboration with RARE is that if you want your ideas to have an impact, you need to mobilize resources. And I was rather naive. It took me about 6 months to figure this out. There was a guy who we'll call Jim at this organization, because in fact his name was Jim. And Jim hated me from the get-go. He was like, who is this egghead academic who suddenly comes in here as a program director out of nowhere because the director hires him and he's got a Jim did not like me, okay? And he was not shy about letting this be known. And so I figured, whatever, I'll just, there's someone like that in every organization, I'll just do my thing. It's about 6 months later that I realized, 2/3 of the staff here work for Jim. And if any idea is going to be implemented, it's going to be Jim's staff. Of course, he probably knew, 10 minutes into the conversation on day one, he was like, yeah, I'll just smile, but he's never getting my staff, right? And so you have to think about where the resources in an organization, the flow of staff, the flow of money, et cetera. Now, in the end, I would say it had some influence. What did we end up doing? We took their existing signature approach, these local pride campaigns, added a policy assessment methodology to it so communities could kind of identify maybe a law that they want to try and change or something that they want to push for in collaboration with others. So it was sort of policy training for this existing methodology, and that's where it went. So that's not me in a university. That's me in RARE every day for a year. That was sort of the degree of influence that was possible in that context, okay? So, in terms of impact, it did have some impact. But now I'd like to turn to a different model. And so in these, with RARE and these other instances with the World Bank and others, I've sort of toyed with this influencing the influencer model, what I'm calling Model A. Well, a few years ago, I decided to try something else, which was to more directly get involved in trying to instill in at least the American public certain ideas that I considered to be important. And this was actually a really big idea, because the idea that I wanted to promote is probably the most researched idea in all of the social sciences over the past 100 years. And the public has never heard about it. And it's about institutions, by which social scientists mean rules and how they structure society. Not even tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of books and articles on this topic of institutions. And I realized that people aren't aware of this and why this might matter for the environment. The idea being, if you want to save the planet, you need to change the rules that underlie it. And I thought, oh, well, I have some skill at sort of popular writing, accessible writing. So let me take this big area of research and crank out a book called Who Rules the Earth? And I went with the commercial publisher in the sense it's through Oxford, but it's their trade division. So it was like kind of the equivalent of a commercial press to try and get it out there, and wrote it without jargon and this sort of thing. And early in this experience, someone in public relations, a friend of mine, said, you know, even though you're working with the commercial arm of a press, they're not going to give you their top PR people. You're going to have to decide how much of this you want to own yourself. I said, really? He said, yeah. So I decided, well, what are the resources around me? We all know the first step in entrepreneurship is this sort of bootstrapping, right? Use what you have to get what you don't have. I have smart students. So I hired 20 students after some fundraising to create a social media website and an animated film and a video game and other materials to try and get this idea through digital media. And so we created something called the Social Rules Project over the course of a couple of years to try and make this happen. And what I'd like to do is share with you about 3 minutes of the film that resulted from this. And the fundraising for this film is actually a story in and of itself. It's about 12 different sources of money. But one of them was the private sector. I went to a friend of mine who owns a business, local business in Claremont. And I said, you know, I am $10,000 short here, and this is killing me. I need to get this project going. And if I can't hire this last animator plus a voice actor, I got nothing. And you know, I described him my needs, and he's a very close friend of mine. And we're over beers, you know, talking about this. And he listened very attentively, and he said, well, the first thing you need to understand is my friends really don't give a shit what you need. I said, what? I said, what's in it for them? Like, okay. And where he was going with that constructively was he was trying to nudge me to recognize that there were some firms that would benefit from being able to say that they were supporting educational projects. Because in fact, an architecture firm, in fact, one of its major clients was institutions of higher learning. And so instead we had a competition to see who had the right to give me money. And the money came in. So this was someone who knows how to raise money in the private sector. Okay, but that whole point of what's in it for them is actually an important one and a kind of recurrent theme here. So let me, so raised the money, went over to CalArts, California Institute of the Arts, is sort of a feeder school for Disney and others, and went to their career day, right? So they all have their laptops out with their animation reels and everything, and they're the tables of the employers. And there's, you know, Sony, and there's Nickelodeon, and then Disney, for some reason, always travels in a packs, you know, so there's like 20 Disney people behind that table. And then there's Harvey Mudd College. So you can imagine the look on the faces of these students when they got a call back from Harvey Mudd College. They figured, you know, a small college wants me, my career is on a downward spiral, right? But what I did was, again, what's in it for me? I was like, all right, how can I pitch this to these talented students and get them to work for me? I said, well, you won't get Disney on your resume this summer if you work for me, but I'll tell you what, I will give you total creative control over 1 minute of this animated film, any style that you wish, okay? It's for a good cause, and I'll pay you, which none of the others would, right? It's all these unpaid exploitative internships, right? So I ended up hiring 11 students, and I'm going to show you a quick bit from this film. This is starting, it's a 10-minute film, and we're going to start at 1 minute in, and then I'm actually going to skip, following my notes, to, at a certain point ahead in the film. So we're going to watch 1 minute of this, I'll skip ahead, and we'll watch another 2 minutes, all right? And this is, again, about trying to mobilize this idea of what are institutions and why do they matter for the planet.
I started to become aware of things I'd never seen before. It's like the world was trying to reveal itself to me. I started to think about the rules we live by. Suddenly it seemed like all the little things we take for granted, even the curve of the sidewalk, are shaped by rules. Rules preserving political struggles of the past. I started to think about the rules that govern the land. What stories would the land tell if it could speak? Who owns the earth? How is that decided? What rights does a landowner have? What responsibilities?
Can't you read, lady?
And now I'm going to skip to 5:59. Oops. Close enough.
I guess we can't live without rules, really. The question is, which rules do we live by? And whose interests do they serve? Do our rules protect the planet or hurt it? Do they promote freedom and opportunity? The rules we make decide whether we live in healthy communities or polluted, forgotten places. And whether it's safe to ride a bicycle. I realized that if you want to change the world, you have to change the rules that we live by. I realized something else too. I can't do this alone. Working together, we started to make real changes. Combining forces with other communities, we put in place new rules that required companies to pay for the pollution they make.
Okay, so that was one of the outcomes of this particular collaboration. It took about 3 years to put all of this stuff together. And it certainly did reasonably well on the film circuit, you know, for a first-time filmmaker and so on. But in terms of its overall impact of this idea, I had two audiences in mind. And so Seth Godin, maybe some of you have seen his TED Talks, is on this topic of sort of how to how to raise public awareness regarding ideas. And he says there's no such thing as public education or social impact. You have to actually identify your public. Who is your tribe? Who is your specialized group of people who actually want to hear this information? Which is very empowering in a sense that you don't have to reach everybody. And so knowing your audience, I had two audiences in mind. One is these materials were directed towards students and their professors. It allows professors to do something interesting in the classroom beyond assigning yet more readings, right? And so the film was deliberately left at 10 minutes, figuring that's very easy to incorporate in a lecture and so forth. There's a video game that plays for 1 hour, and that's, you know, reasonable as a homework assignment and so forth. But the other, and I reached that audience no problem. So the professors, certainly within political science, are all aware of these materials. But the other more difficult, sort of ambitious audience was I really wanted a lot of people in the American public to bump into these materials. And I would say I failed at that pretty miserably, fell really short of that. And one thing I learned from that experience is that the internet is not flat. Maybe some of you have heard this book title from Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat. The internet is not flat, and what I mean by that is it is not democratic and accessible. Now, maybe to some of you this was fairly obvious from the start. I don't know. For me, it was something of a lesson. So it's tempting to believe that anybody who produces some compelling material stands a shot at that being distributed widely. It's tempting to believe that because we've all seen so many of these videos of someone just, shot in their, not just the, the cat jumping off the wall, it's one of my favorites, but, actual things with content. We even see things with content that have gone somewhat viral, and it was made on a low budget by someone with their phone, and we think, oh, anybody can do it. No, anybody can generate it, but it's like saying anybody can win the lottery. There are gatekeepers, and these gatekeepers are in charge of major blogs. These gatekeepers are the editors of The New Yorker. These gatekeepers are the people who decide whether an idea is going to be on the Ellen DeGeneres show or on late night, talk show or not. And it's pretty profoundly difficult to actually get ideas through. It works through, so it used to be prior to the internet that if you wanted to spread ideas, you had to either be a professor and do this through a book, right? Or a really rich person who could just, have your own publishing company, maybe a politician, right? So it's very undemocratic, very limited. Now I would say it's more through who you know. It's more through who you know. So yeah, I landed a summary of this stuff in the Huffington Post because the publicist at my college happened, that was her one contact, is at the Huffington Post, and it scrolls through the HuffPo and then it's gone, right? And yes, I landed one in, what is that thing called, Slate, because someone at the press had one contact there. But the way these work, like something like The New Yorker, you can't publish in the New Yorker, are you kidding? You can't even submit to them, it would be insulting, you're not allowed to. You have to know someone. And you're not allowed to approach a commercial publisher. You can't write to a commercial publisher. No one is allowed to do that. No author is allowed to contact them. You have to find an agent, and the agent's allowed to talk to them. And so the agent decides whether they're going to work with you or not. And who are these agents anyway? They're just agents, and some of them are well known. Okay, so there's a variety of gatekeepers. I don't want to suggest the system's totally busted, but it's quite strange. It's really who you know in order to reach some of these amplifiers out there. Let me keep moving a little faster here because I want to make sure to leave time for discussion afterward. But I want to note one more thing here, which is high cost plus high uncertainty, not so smart. So the Social Rules Project, make no mistake, it's had some influence, and as I say, within academia, absolutely, I think it's helped to get the idea of institutional analysis out there for sure. And I get some positive feedback about the book and so forth. But it was very high cost in terms of time. I would say tens of thousands of hours, right? 3 computer science students working 10 hours per week for 3 years. A team of animators, 12 grants, just all in, right? And sometimes in life you have to do that all in, right? But this was combined with high uncertainty about whether I would be able to actually have a broader social impact. And so you really don't want to do high cost, high uncertainty, right? Low cost, high uncertainty, sure, right? Spend a summer on a really cool project, and who knows what, whether this will have the intended impact. High cost, high certainty, absolutely, go for it, right? The president has said, she's going to adopt your recommendations, so spend a year working on them around the clock. But high cost, high uncertainty, I don't regret doing the project, but I definitely came out of it bruised and battered. So then, one more experience that I'd like to share with you folks before opening it up. And this is took unexpected twists and turns. So I had been thinking for a while, wouldn't it be cool to have a class that took place entirely on bicycles and visited different city halls using that bicycle infrastructure and safety as a way to learn about the politics of how to bring about change at the city level? And wouldn't it be cool if the whole class took place on bikes? And it was one of those crazy one-day ideas. And then I think I was short of money one summer to take my family on vacation or something, and this grant proposal comes through the college for civic engagement and classes. I was like, okay, and I submitted my proposal, and damn it, it got funded, so I had to do it. And so the final experience concerns something called Bicycle Revolution. So this class, I raised some money with an alum, got bikes for the students, had students from throughout the Claremont colleges join, and we actually made a documentary film about it. And what happened was the grant the person who gave this local grant was a documentary filmmaker. And she said, oh, she had some experience with that. Said, oh, we should make a film about your class. I said, yeah, cool, sounds good to me, so long as you guys do it all. I'm done with art. I'm like, let me be a political scientist again. You guys do this. And she said, sure. And I told the students, you got to be willing to be in a film. They all had to sign something. And then she quit, the filmmaker. So I was like, okay, everybody just signed up thinking they're going to be in a film, and she quit. What do I do? Well, I am in Los Angeles, so I asked a media studies person, do you know anybody? And he's like, yeah, I have a friend, Kevin, who might be able to do this. We met at a cafe, and Kevin said, yeah, I could make your film for you. It sounds good. It sounds really exciting. I love bikes. I'll do this for you if you guys have the cameras and the student helpers. I was like, cool. So afterwards, I was like, who the heck is Kevin Fox? Well, he was the executive producer of the original Blair Witch Project. That's who's like underemployed at a cafe in Los Angeles, right? So Kevin decided to do this project for us, and I didn't let him choose the music because his music taste sucks. So I went to our local DJs and I was like, I want it to be local LA music. Who can you recommend? And they said, well, what cities did you visit? And I was like, what do you mean? They're like, what cities did you visit? I'm like, El Monte? They're like, the Red Pears. And I went through and they could like name all these local bands. So it's local music, and what we did with this is kept it to about 50 minutes long, so that it could be used in bicycle advocacy groups. I figure a meeting lasts an hour and a half, keep it relatively short so it could be followed by discussion as a discussion starter. So I'm going to show you just the trailer from this film. It lasts, I think, 2 minutes.
Can we change the world? Can my generation change the world? That's a hard question.
Well, I lost my way. It's hard to say. I was tools for engagement to talk about these larger issues that we're dealing with.
I can make such a substantial impact through local politics.
Suggest you come to a meeting and propose it.
Your friends go, that's so cool that you run out and say, oh, right.
Once you accept that, maybe all it takes is getting those people in the same room talking to each other.
In order to make that happen, we need to organize.
Citizen Beer is actually doing a good job. Like, that's cool.
I'm on every committee that I can possibly get on.
This is the nexus of a lot of necessary social change.
Everybody wants to make changes, but nobody talks to the people who can help them make the change.
I'm a huge fan of seeing youth doing it.
It's not about, oh, the next generation is going to make the change, like we are that generation.
Long live the bike revolution.
Till I found my way.
So, this project, unlike the Social Rules project, I just kind of stumbled into this. I thought, okay, I'll launch this class. Yeah, sure, let's make a documentary. And yes, there was a year and a half of post-filming, editing. Yeah, there was grunt work for sure involved. This one actually has had quite an impact, unexpectedly. And I'd like in just the final 2 or 3 minutes to sort of reflect a little bit on what's going on there. One part of it, I think, has to do with the idea and the saleability of the idea itself. So it's one thing for me to say to a group of people, well, if you want to know how to protect the planet, you need to understand the rules that shape our everyday existence, and it ranges from constitutions to property rights to cultural norms to contracts, and therefore if we want to save the planet, we need to change the rules. Versus, oh, we're about the politics of creating bike-friendly cities. Yes, get it. Instantly understandable, right? Instantly understandable. And so there's the idea itself, and there's the sort of timing of it. So I would say that one of the challenges here is that if we were a public relations firm, we would say which of these ideas is going to that we could launch is really going to be easily understandable. And we would only go with the ones that are easily understandable, right? So if idea number 4 is great, we think it's wonderful, but our focus groups are like, I don't know what you're talking about, it's gone, right? We're picking and choosing. In contrast, how about when you don't get to move across the ideas? Like, no, this really is one of the most important ideas in the last 100 years of social science research. So that's very interesting as a kind of tension, right? Likewise, if you're a business and you're like, oh, this is a great idea. Yeah, but we can't make money off it. You don't go, yeah, but it's a really good idea. Let's go with it anyway. No, it's like everybody would laugh you out of the room, right? And so that whole question of scalability becomes quite challenging. Also, timing. So in this case, not only was there organizations in place throughout the United States that are interested in this, but the timing, meaning local bicycle advocacy groups, but the timing, I have to use a surfing analogy because I'm from California. It's kind of like you don't want to catch the wave too early. You don't want to catch it too late. You want it right at that sweet spot. And for creating bike-friendly cities, all these cities in the United States right now are like, it seems we should be doing something. So the timing is right. We're now, in terms of local impact, the students are working with 3 different cities around us, directly involved in providing feedback on policy. Just last night was a big premiere in the city of Laverne, where they're bringing about change there that they attribute to having these 15 smiling kids arrive on in yellow jerseys in their city saying, what are you guys doing about bike infrastructure? It's now being shown in San Diego, it's being shown in Sacramento, it's being shown in Davis, it's being shown in North Carolina, it's being shown in Minnesota. And we've only started on our list of 900 bicycle groups that we're reaching out to. And so it's weird. This is having an impact far beyond what I would have imagined. And so just closing thoughts here. First is the seed does not make the soil. The sort of soil, the institutional and social context in which an idea is introduced it's not just going to change to meet the idea. And so in this case, one idea, its time had come, and another really had not. Number 8, I would say, yes, I was passionate about all these things. I had fun meeting a bunch of local bands, and so as painful as it was, I was also, exploring my personal passion. So maybe passion plus a little strategy is what moves the world. And finally, I'd like to suggest that all of these sorts of things require that we move beyond the fetish of interdisciplinary studies. So how radical is it, and I'm very much a product of interdisciplinary studies, how radical is it for a political science professor to walk a quarter mile across campus and knock on the door of a physics professor and collaborate? Like, since the 1970s or earlier, we've been saying interdisciplinary studies are a radical new approach, that's necessary for social change. And I'm not against interdisciplinary studies by any means. What I mean to say is it needs to be intersocial. How about if instead you're going 10 miles and knocking on the door of the chief of a fire department? Right, to talk about, do we really have to have wide streets in order for your trucks to get through? Could we do something to slow down traffic? In other words, these sorts of collaborations require moving across industries, across social sectors. And I would suggest that that is a fundamentally different type of collaboration that requires a fundamentally different mindset beyond just interdiscipline, which is really just academics talking to other academics, at least that's my editorial. All right, so with that, sorry to talk for such a long period of time, but I welcome any thoughts, commentary you folks might have. Anyone? Yes?
All right, so in terms of with the video and the whole, we have to understand the rules and change the rules in order to make any sort of change, there was one scene in it where kind of started to touch on it because it had a big factory with piles and piles of money on top of it. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on like the capitalist system, and if that's something that you truly think really needs to be taken down or just needs revised, or what are your thoughts on that?
Great question. So, let me answer it in a slightly roundabout way, which is to say we often hear that it's about markets or regulations, but actually markets are regulation. So markets are impossible without thousands and thousands and thousands of regulations. So think about what it takes for a company to have factories in 3 countries, all of the labor contracts, all of the rules, the safety rules within the factory, the guarantee of property rights, and so forth. So capitalism really is a collection of rules as our markets. In terms of the major impetus of what the seeking of profit is doing to the planet, I think we have to compare it to other systems that are not seeking profit, that arguably have been doing the same thing to the planet. So I think it's going to be important to distinguish between capitalism and industrialization, and simply human economic activity. Just to put my cards on the table, I'm a sort of left of center, embrace the market, but as Lionel Jospin, the foreign minister of France, said, I want a market economy but not a market society, right? So I believe there should be parts of society that are absolutely not driven by market logic, but I'm not one who sees the situation as one in which, as long as capitalism proceeds, that ultimately we're rearranging chairs on the Titanic. But that's just my personal viewpoint. Others, anyone, please, and then over here, yeah.
So we had a speaker yesterday who had done a pretty large research project, and at the end, towards the end, found out that it was possibly slightly illegal or is not entirely legal for logistical reasons and things like that. What do you recommend is the best avenue for designers to take to change rules that aren't necessarily there because things are dangerous, just because they're not currently recognized, in order to bring their designs into the real world?
That's a great question. So a good example of this would be LEED certification. So in the case of LEED certification, and I was interviewing for this book David Gottfried, who was the one who really got that up and running. When he came in to that industry as a real estate developer, he found that the rulemaking system was broken, because the rulemaking system, I'm trying to remember the name of the organization, it was ASTM International, and he was on a committee for green buildings, and they voted by consensus, and individual companies were allowed to be members of that committee, so they could never get past the opposition of those companies. And so they actually created a new organization, a new rulemaking organization, the Green Building Council, which had different voting rules, and that's how they were able to create green standards. So I'd say, explore the machinery of rulemaking, like really go in there and get process expertise by talking to people who've been doing it for decades. It's like if you want to bring about change in a university, sometimes you'll hear someone just stand up and say, this needs to happen now, and it's like, you want to find the professor and senior administrators who other professors and administrators point to as someone who knows how to bring about change. And you say, how would you go about this? And they'll say, oh, well, you have to start with this committee. Don't go to that committee until you go to this committee first, because they had something that happened 10 years ago. And there's a lot of, like process expertise is something that's undervalued, I think. We talk about substantive expertise. The bike lane must be this wide, but we don't talk about process expertise, namely, how exactly do you approach a mayor? And so the way to gather that sort of unwritten, unpublished, because it's not polite to talk about process expertise, is to talk with the people who've been doing it for decades. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, right behind you, and then up here. Yes.
In general, do you recommend people to go to existing organizations with their ideas, or is it sometimes better to create one and create your own team?
Yes and yes. That's a great question. I think you already know something of the answer by virtue of the way you cast it. It's really going to depend. There will be, certainly it's harder to create a new organization in many respects, right? It's just going to be more vulnerable. You have to get everything up and running. But sometimes an existing organization, sometimes if we're not seeing change, it's not because the opposition is stronger. It's because our proponents aren't doing the right thing, right? I would say this is true of our major environmental organizations. There's no grassroots movement in the United States. They don't train grassroots organizers. They're these very hierarchical organizations, something like Greenpeace, and I've debated the director of Greenpeace on this very topic. You send out everybody to collect money, all these talented young people, and have these conversations, but they have no real decision-making power within the organization. Their job is just to collect money and then send it up to a very small group of people at the top, make decisions. I was arguing, invert the pyramid, empower them to hold community meetings and do things. No. And so that would be a case where I feel like there would need to be a new organization that is focused on true grassroots mobilization, which I think 350.org gets at and some others try and get at. But yeah, so it's, if possible, I'd say work with the existing organization because it's just easier, but sometimes you truly have to create a new one or a new unit within one. Conservation International was created when the Nature Conservancy was so slow to embrace international issues that the whole international division of the Nature Conservancy said bye, and they created Conservation International. So that's another model. Yes, sir?
How and when do you work on developing a method of appraising, evaluating how much change you actually accomplished in a grassroots campaign? Because a lot of times, especially the grassroots, I think people work on something and they say that the people we want to change are still saying they're not paying any attention. But if you're kind of on the outside, you can say, actually, they are picking up. They're just not saying they got it from you, you know?
Right.
And this is a problem that a lot of people they don't really recognize when they're succeeding. On the other hand, if they just say, oh, we're making a difference, they might just be fooling themselves. So what's your, do you start with some parameters in the beginning, or do you have that kind of discussion when you work on it a while? Are we making a difference, even though everybody says we're ignoring you all?
Right. Oh, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of both. There's a lot of people fudging it. So major environmental organizations will often all take credit for the same. So when Mexico decided, what was that big fight near the salt factory, I believe, in Baja, and there's a whale calving grounds there, and Mexico decided to protect it and not allow development. Like 10 environmental organizations in the United States were like, see what we did, with our effort. Like they're all claiming the same victory. And there's a lot that are really just spinning wheels and spinning out reports. And as you say, there's also organizations that are absolutely having an impact, but it's just when you want to move the United States to organic agriculture now, it doesn't feel like a success. So I agree with the benefits of choosing measurable impacts. So one could say, for example, how many cities have adopted an active transportation plan, and at the same time, especially when it comes to public education, causation is a weird thing. And we run into this just within the last 20 years. There's been this big movement for greater accountability. When foundations give you money and everybody, they don't call it evaluation anymore, they call it assessment, and what are your measurable impacts? It's a little tricky because what is the impact, for example, of a particular class on students? And you say, all right, we want to know the impact on the students, what was the outcome? It's relational causation. The impact of a teaching experience on students is a function not only of what was taught, but of the students' interests, motivation, career directions, et cetera. And therefore, 10 years later, a student might say, oh yeah, I learned something about this in college, and so I think I'm going to go in this direction now. In other words, the causal impact changes as a function of changing life experience with that person over time because it's relational. So that's weird when causation can actually change over time as someone grows and develops. So I think that the whole emphasis on measuring effectiveness is sometimes a little naive with respect to methodology, and yet people need to know that they're having an impact or they're not going to stick with it in some sense. I think that's why you had so much burnout in the arguments against the arms race. It's like, well, how do you stop the arms race if you're, citizens of Kansas for peace, right? You're on a street corner with a sign, bless them, right? Every weekend trying to do this, but you need to have some sort of tangible win. And so I think that people do need to feel and experience tangible wins, and that we need to take very seriously the sense of fulfillment of the people who are working in grassroots organizations. Like, let that be the top priority, because otherwise people will just burn out. So it's a great, great question. And I'll let the organizers stop me whenever, because I'll keep going with these great questions. Yes?
So you mentioned that being embedded within an organization and being able to dedicate all of your time and having a staff that's working toward disseminating these ideas and actually putting them into practice is probably the most effective way to create this change. So then why are you in academia?
Great question. So I like academia. So I like what I do, and I'm just, I guess it's really my comparative advantage. So I could be an organizer full-time and I would maybe be okay. But I noticed, just as I was growing up and so forth, it's like, oh, I'm better at this thing than and I find it very fulfilling. So I love research. I'm a research geek who is toying around with social media and new educational approaches. So it's much more of a personal fulfillment choice, which I think is very important. We can't all just say, well, what does society need? Okay, then that's what I'll be. It's like, are you kidding? It has to be an overlap of what does society need and then what is fulfilling to me personally. Yeah, so it's because I'm a geek is the short answer. Yeah. Yes, sir?
Okay. My question is, I like the last point here, you talk about the intersocial. Actually, of course, there are so many resources in the society, but somehow currently there are no coordination, there are no cooperation among those resources. So I have one question in particular. Several years ago, I think Portland has the bike routes and along some kind of a general street, but one woman was killed because, I don't think the offender ever been caught. She just driving, she thought that she was on the right place, but the problem is some people, at least some, they just didn't, respect. Okay, even there is policy, there is somehow some people, they are still not internalized how to, they have equal rights like a driver. My question is like to talk about gun violence. Today, of course, there are many efforts to try to say, have a policy to control the gun, the purchase of gun and some kind of restriction. The problem is, if most people, they still believe in violence, they believe violence is a solution to their problem, to their personal problem, then to an interpersonal problem, then you even have the policy in there, doesn't mean that you can stop this kind of thinking. So in your ideas is how to use whatever, the social media or resources to change the mind, not just you can change the policy, you can make a city to build something, but you won't change their ideas or false beliefs. How can you use the?
That's a great point, and it brings to mind green paint on bike lanes. Okay. Right, so what is green paint on bike lanes really accomplishing? Right? So on the one hand, it's like, okay, it's a little more visible, it's a little safer, but it's also signaling something to drivers, isn't it? It's saying, we take bikes seriously now, right? It's saying something's different here, something's happening. I'm supposed to just be aware that cyclists belong on the road. And so that's kind of combining your two, like you've got the rules that say, all right, we're going to put paint down now, and then the mindsets sometimes, well, I don't need to tell designers and architects about how the built environment can affect mindsets, right? But so I think that's one possible way of combining it. But you're absolutely right. You can have a law in the books that is either not known by anybody or simply not respected, and what's that really going to achieve? So you have to have both parts, as you point out. Yeah. Yes?
I had a question, getting back to your discussion of process and becoming a process expert, I think is what you said. At what point does it become either better from like kind of a what is the right thing to do perspective, but also more effective if a process itself is broken to either circumnavigate it or work to change it? And how, I guess, do you see the relationship between figuring out a process and working within it and eliminating bad processes?
Yes, that's a great question as well. I'd say you have to understand the process first, right? And then you can make a decision as to whether you can work within it or not. So, it really takes a sort of deep immersion in how do things work around here. And you'll have, when it comes to process expertise, you have to diversify your sources, just like any research paper, right? You'll have someone will say, let me tell you how things work around here, right? Here's how City Hall works. It's like there must be some classic anthropological study of the translator and the power that the translator has. Oh, the chief just said. It's like, really? So when someone says, let me tell you how things work around here, I've found that person, especially when you're not from around there, has so much knowledge and yet so much power that you have to diversify your knowledge sources. Sort of good research practice generally. And then once you get that fuller picture, I think that's precisely when you can decide, is this even worth trying to do something within this process, or is this just never going to change? And so I'd say it's kind of both. Like one needs the process expertise to figure out whether it's worth sticking with that process. Others, yes?
I hope I get this right.
You already have it right. You're speaking up, you got it right.
In Who Rules the Earth, there's a part where a city is rating, creates like a rating system on companies based on color and their sustainability. So like if
Factories.
they're really bad in sustainability and create pollutants, they're graded as black. And then the ones that are sustainable are green.
That's Indonesia proper, and it's factories, not cities. Yeah.
So how did that color rating system influence people's views of these companies? Could you talk about that?
Oh, that's a great point. This is a case of basically publicizing pollution. So it's one thing for a company to pollute, it's another for the public to actually be aware of it. And it goes to this question of, do people care? So the United States was the first place to do this with the toxics release inventory, where the EPA said, all right, companies, even if it's legal, you have to report what pollution you're putting in the air. Even if you're, totally up to spec and, you're within the allowable levels, just publicize it. And they're like, well, okay. And you publicize it, and suddenly the neighbors are like, why are you putting so much pollution in the air? So it mobilizes public pressure. And Indonesia took this idea and went one farther, where they had a lot of companies that were out of compliance, and the environment minister will, what's his name, Nabil Makarim, I believe, who I interviewed. Getting an interview with him, by the way, was really interesting, sort of finding my way into his hotel room in the Watergate Hotel to have this interview. But it was fascinating. He was like on this lounge chair, with his coffee and cigarette. So he figured out this system in which in week 1, they say, all right, we're going to announce which are the gold companies that are so far beyond compliance, they're just amazing. And the press is there, and everybody, and handshakes and so on. And the next week, it's like now the green companies that are within compliance. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, thank you. And then the next week, it's all right. Now I think brown is the next color scheme that are out of compliance, and so they're getting very nervous. And then black is the final color that's used, and they have the World Bank analyzed this, and they showed stock prices plummeting after the announcement of this, because reputation is so important in many societies where the laws don't work well. Your reputation is everything, and so as a factory director, if your reputation has been sullied, suddenly that's a big deal. To the point of your question regarding the color choice, I'm not sure of the representations of those different colors, but I do know that initially they had to change because one of the colors was too close to one of the major political parties and the color that they use on their ballots. And so they had to quickly change it because it had the wrong sort of connotation. Yeah. Other questions or? Yes.
We can continue this conversation later. A panel or a roundtable kind of discussion at 7 o'clock. Please come back, and also we'll have a dinner reception afterwards. So if you want to connect and talk more with Paul, we can do that later.
And thanks for the great questions.